world has in design thinking and bring it directly into instruction, including through literacy in this moment with Mark, who is a fantastic consultant. And I'll kind of let him introduce himself just a tiny bit.
Mark OVERMEYER from Denver, and I've been doing this kind of work with consulting for about the past 12 years or so. And I met Jim when I went to AISV in Vienna, doing some work around standards-based grading systems and also some work with reading and writing workshop, and really looking forward to today. Jim, I'm not sure, is your screen shared with all? Because I don't see the screen share. I don't.
Yeah, I think so.
I can see it at my end.
Okay.
Oh,
all
I'm
right.
sorry.
Okay, if people can't see it, let me know. So I think our name should be up there right now with our emails and all that good stuff. Super. All right, well, jump in a little bit, see where we are. We have three main parts. The brief, extremely brief history of access and education. It really helps set up what we're going to be talking about as the main two parts, both design access and teaching and learning, where there's some really neat design concepts that get you right into that moment where you're working with students on literacy and other things as well. We're going to kind of be using the literacy frame today. And it's going to be kind of a structure of thinking about how to go in tomorrow to use new terms and new concepts to work effectively with teachers, colleagues, and so forth. And then also look at micro moments that we're going to kind of drill down more specifically in that idea of micro moments of learning in literacy as well. And Mark and I are going to kind of balance back and forth between those two main pieces. And to do so, I want to ask Mark this question. If you are interested in putting that in the chat box and answers to this question as well, please do so. But this was a piece that kind of got us going for a second in that creative mode. So think about this question. What would you do to make a lesson not inclusive? Mark, you had a great story that kind of went with that idea.
And one of the things that Jim and I will be doing throughout is doing some things that are kind of what we would call provocations. So this is kind of a provocation to kind of nudge our thinking. So probably my interest in a lot of the work that Jim and I are talking about today began long ago. My second year teaching, it was in the fall, and I was teaching sixth grade. And the teacher who was responsible for all the students who had been identified as gifted and talented let me know that those students would be missing my class that day because they were going to see the Colorado Opera performance. So it was a sort of a in-house decision to take those students only to the opera. So later on in that day, after those students were gone, one of my other students came up and he said, where's my friend so-and-so? Where's my friend Jeff? And I said, well, he's at the opera. And he's like, well, that's weird because I'm in the opera on Saturday. So I had a student in that class who was actually in some of the Colorado Opera performances because he was part of the Colorado Children's Chorale. But this idea of inclusivity, it sort of meant, so what I thought about was who made the decision to decide that these students identified and gifted and talented would go to the opera and no one else would. And therefore we leave behind students who are actually in the performance. So my thinking about inclusivity and exclusivity began long ago, but that was one of the most interesting moments, as opposed to many schools I've taught in. You know, everybody goes to theater performances, obviously. I'm not saying that this was done by some type of ill intent. It's just interesting to me that a student pointed out how ironic it was that a bunch of kids are going to the opera, but I can't go because I'm not identified as part of a certain group, even though I'm performing with that group.
It's a good one. In the chat box, we have one attendee noting, Beata in Vienna, I'd write and speak in a language that not everybody speaks well enough to follow and participate. Absolutely. Immediately, you're cutting a group away from that. And sometimes it's a language, sometimes it's parts of speech, sometimes it's analogies and that sort of stuff. Different parts of language can certainly begin to inhibit students' access to learning it in your room. For me, I had a situation where I was asked to do these tickets if students came to my room in non-compliance of one of these three things. One of them would be showing up late, not having their materials, and not having their homework. And the first time I had to do this, it was sort of set up in a team, and we were asked to do this. At the beginning of the year happened, and my first kid came in without their materials. And I had this slip for them that they had to fill out. They didn't bring their pencil case. So it was my job to then hand them a slip and say, okay, fill this out for not having your materials. But I had to lend them a pencil to fill that out. So the ironic piece or the ironic twist of this was immense. So I just gave them a pencil and I threw the slips away and I never used them again. And it really showed me how I was inhibiting their accessibility to my learning by not just giving them a pencil, instead dinging them, as you'll see later, spiking them for that, having done that. So thank you for the participation. So we'll move on a little bit. And Mark, you actually kind of got us started down this road. There's this great movie. You and I were chatting, I think digitally like this in 2020, early 2020. And you mentioned this movie and I had to go see it. And I had a connection to it through a podcast. Tell me a little bit about the movie.
So Crip Camp is a movie that's on Netflix right now, where it's a film about the disability rights movement. It began in the 70s and continues to this day. And not only is it an extraordinary documentary, when I talked to Jim, I said it really strikes me that I knew nothing about the people in this video, these true heroes of this movement, even though my initial degree that I graduated with in 1983 was in working with students who need intervention. So I had all kinds of courses about how to meet the needs of students who are disabled in different ways or differently abled. And yet I knew nothing about this movement. And it was happening at the same time that I was in college. And so again, not only is it just a brilliant film and fits in perfectly with the idea of design, which Jim is going to talk about in a little bit, but this whole movement was something that is sort of not studied as much as I think it should. So it's sort of our discussion about that sort of led us to think about how can we think about access in education, and Jim's work and thinking around design, because they mesh beautifully in this film, in these stories. So I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, I love it. I love the intersection of design and access as a movement and education together. It was a brilliant film for me as well. This entire slideshow is available at my blog. If you want, I'll go back and show you this. It'll come up later. It's schooldesign.com with a K. And you can click the link and watch the film from there. And also in an article you'll find on my blog is a 12-minute synopsis of the movement and its results as well. So there's a couple different pieces you can kind of connect with. But it really hit home to me, like when I make small decisions, micro decisions in the classroom, to large decisions that we make when we're designing a school, that the design of what we're doing can inhibit or it can provide greater access to students of all types. And it really was just the engine behind this film, the engine behind where Mark and I went with this project. And so let's get into that a little bit and kind of dig into what has allowed us to genuinely think about access in schools in the way in which we do today. And I want to turn that back over to Mark a little bit.
Just to briefly, a brief overview, the work around equal access laws and what really changed a lot of education work in America started with the disability rights movement and the Americans with Disabilities Act, which mainly had to do with physical barriers, which Jim's going to talk about soon. But the biggest thing that affected in education in terms of how students who needed some type of intervention or needed something to support their learning was definitely the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, but more the 94-142. And without getting into too much of the weeds about this, basically then the Individuals with Disabilities Act, the individualized education program came about. So what that meant was that any school that received any type of federal funding required teachers in that school, required those public schools to provide access to all, regardless of their disability. So prior to that time, often students were maybe segregated into separate facilities, or they weren't given access near the access. So even when I first started teaching, it would be rare to have a student, for example, who was autistic in my class who would be mainstreamed. I'm just being honest with you. And so those of you who've been teaching a long time know maybe that truth. And that moved all the way to a lot more inclusion. So it took a long time, but the IEP, the Individualized Education Program, really supported that thinking. And there's many things in American education that frustrate me, and I can't say I'm proud about, but I'm very proud of what America has done around this work. And having worked in international schools, I see brilliant work around this as well. The one thing that perhaps a provocation to think about, though, when I think about this work, when I was an interventionist, one thing just to think about this idea of the individualized education program, the whole intent of something like that is to provide access. It's not to it's meant to support the student in their least restrictive environment. It's not meant to support teachers who are working with those students. So a concrete example I can give you of that, a couple of quick examples. When I was an interventionist, there was a student that I tested and the psychologist tested. This student was seen as needing some reading intervention, but rather than just putting that student in my class because I was staffed to do that and adding that student to my group, we had a meeting. His classroom teacher was one of the most extraordinary reading teachers I've ever met. She taught courses in the district on how to be a better reading teacher. So we decided his least restrictive environment was with her, and she and the student would decide if they needed extra support. So again, the idea is it's to meet the needs of the student, not staffing. As opposed to one school I taught in when I was a classroom teacher, I did not have any students in my class that particular year that according to testing, according to data, needed reading intervention, but the reading interventionist was full-time, and the principal came to me and said, you need to make sure that your students who are the lowest readers in your class go to her because that's where the staffing is. In other words, I need to keep her busy was the message. So again, the idea of the least restrictive environment is based on the needs of the child and access for the student. It's not supposed to be based on, we have this slot, and so therefore we need to fill this teacher's classes.
All right. And with that, I think we can jump right into this next provocation. How do we as educators provide students access to become independent learners? So what you were sort of noting in those examples is that line between when we're inhibiting and providing kind of that access. We want to dig into that a little bit more thoroughly and through some lenses as well. So in thinking about defining that so we can kind of study it a little bit more deeply, I might ask myself, how do we provide quality access to learning, with a question mark that might be hidden on your screen? Access to learning at their own pace and with one's strengths are two pieces that mean a lot to me. For example, a lot of times we're asking students to test on a calendar, or we're asking students to accomplish certain things according to a schedule. Part of that's the nature of how we do our teaching and our instructing by moving the class as a whole along. But we don't often stop to ask ourselves what each kid needs with time. Some of our students are running through the literature quickly, but maybe only in one genre. Or maybe I need students in a math classroom more time before they go to a math assessment to do that. And finding that flexibility in both pacing and allowing them to deal with their own strengths is a big deal too. Having kids, say, do a math assessment orally instead of written, or allow students to explore topics within literature that we want to practice in a place, in a genre that they're comfortable with. Maybe they know nothing about nonfiction and they're very good in fiction broadly, or fantasy is something that they're very good in, but we want to explore other themes. And if that's really what's going to help get them there, then we need to sort of provide a frame through fantasy without moving them towards the text that maybe others are happening to use. So how can they access that, learn the core idea behind the learning that we want, when they're ready to do so and how they're ready to do so is a thing that we can think about. And then Mark, I think you have a couple of thoughts on access as well.
Yeah, so the idea of access to growth opportunities. So the way we design our work with students, regardless of where they are, should support growth. And I think as much as I support the standards-based movement, one of the things that can happen, when I was working with some 7th graders one year, one of the students said to me, when we were really explaining the standards-based, and this is the standards that are required, these are the standards, it was a writing course, we were talking about the writing standards, and he said, what if I've already met these? You know, what if I'm already here? It's only September, what if I'm already here? Am I done? So I think one of the things we have to be cautious about is that idea, if we say the goal is the standard, I think the goal, no matter where the student is to provide access to growth. So the work that we design should provide opportunities for all students to grow from where they are, yes, toward the standard, but then just keep going. So the idea is that we're not done. So we open up the idea of learning opportunities that we provide for students to see that all of the work we're doing is a potential for you to grow. And what that allows, that accessibility for enabling them, it allows them to, it enables learners to start to become agents of their own learning. it provides opportunities. I've seen it in many classrooms that think in this way, where students come to the teacher and say, this is what I need. This is what I need from you so I can keep growing. And I think that's one of the ideas that connect access and design, is that if we design our classrooms to provide growth and to support learners to become agents of their own learning, that's sort of where we want to be.
Super. And that brings us to now a framework we want you to be able to leave with, a toolkit of concepts. And the first might feel a little bit less related to education, but I will link them back in tightly. Mark and I will kind of jump back and forth with this, but they're design concepts in this designing access in teaching and learning. And then we're going to kind of drill down a little bit deeper into this idea that we're going to call micro moments. And what we hope that you take away from these next two phases of this webinar are things you can use immediately tomorrow, that you can go in and kind of think about this term, identify where it is and what it is, and use it with your colleagues and your teachers at your school, and use this language, this powerful language, to drive you guys that much further, that much quicker. So in doing so, I want to kind of jump back to what Mark and I were both saying, is looking at agency and learning. I think that was kind of the ending thread there. And as teachers, we are designers. So as I get into these design terms, I want you to carefully consider that. I see it more and more all the time on Twitter. I'm seeing articles about it in big magazines to say that teachers are designers, principals are designers. Anyone who works in a school are designing the experience, the physical experience, the learning experience, the testing experience, whatever it might be. We are designing the pieces in which that our students are accessing every single day. And what do we want to design? And that kind of gets back to that agency part that we're thinking of, that second half of the sentence. What are the decisions that we want students to be able to make? That agency, that it isn't just that I'm thinking about the outcome that the student would achieve, but I want to design for their choices that they're making in their own learning. And the first idea that I'm going to get to, and again, let me connect these. I think they're great stuff, and Mark and I are going to connect them together a little bit. Going along with that film, Crip Camp, there was a guy named Ed Roberts in Berkeley in the 1960s who was kind of in this movement, but not highlighted in the movie very well, who had really worked on these curb cuts. And as you can see, a wheelchair may not use this curb nearly as well as, say, one like this. And this curb has a lot of things to it that work really well. And anytime that I'm using this in a series or a lecture, whatever it might be, there's some great ideas. People raise their hand and they tell me who they think could use this curb besides someone in a wheelchair, because that's the emblematic piece of a curb cut, is that we design something that's great for the neediest, but it happens to be useful to many others. So I get answers like baby buggies, delivery folks, small children, people with crutches that are trying to move around the city. And there's this one that someone rose their hand, and I always repeat it because I love it so much. This gentleman rose his hand, and he looked at me, and and I said, "Well, who is this good for?" And this teacher said, "Drunk people in the middle of the night." Like, yeah, you're right. It's got haptic feedback on the surface. It's multicolored. It's sloped very gently. It's got well-lit strips from the street lamp so you can see where it is, and a clear big path is how to get to the other side of the street. Not really, something that we all want to be is inebriated and not able to move around the city, but no matter what the condition is that someone is in, they can use this. And designers around the world have really picked up this idea of a curb cut as a shortcut term to describe something that was designed for the neediest in their population, but is beneficial to all. And that is, for me, in education, that intersection as to where, when I know I'm designing something for the neediest in my school or in my classroom, that I'm able to see more broadly who else that's going to benefit. And when I find curb cuts or tricks that help my neediest, that I can identify as to help everyone, that feels like gold to me. That feels like the moment where I realize this is something that's going to change my school. It's going to change my teaching, and it's going to change what I'm able to do with students, because it's not just that I identified a real need out there, but I improved everyone's access to that learning. Mark, I can't remember. Did you have something you were going to add into this one? Or okay,
one thing to think about. Sometimes I think sometimes I've learned from viewing classrooms like Jim's, and I'm sure he can talk about how he sets up his paper for his test. But sometimes sometimes it is something simple that is actually physical. So one of my favorite kindergarten writing workshops that I had the opportunity to co-teach in for a time, the teacher did this brilliant work with just different types of paper. The students were making books, and she realized some students were literally limited in their ability to show what they could do as writers because they needed to draw bigger or write bigger. So one of the first decisions she taught her kindergarten students to make as they made books is, what kind of paper do you need to do your work today? So and then I would have students, take me through what their decision making was. So I was following a student around one day, and she said, so I need this kind of paper because it's blank, because I'm going to just do a picture on this page. But then on the next page, I'm going to do some writing underneath my picture, but I'm going to use this paper with this line thickness because these are thick enough for me to write. I mean, so the whole idea that it was literally physical, that had she just been given one kind of paper, she may not have been able to demonstrate, she may not have had access to agency to show that I can do this work if you just give me the right kind of paper. And I think now I can just speak for the states. The concern I have around some of this physical nature of things, I can just speak to Colorado. All kindergarten students in October have to take a computer test with a mouse to show what they know about reading. And they have to use a mouse. Well, I can barely use a mouse any longer. And that's the number one piece of data that's used to determine if a student at age 5 is going to be proficient in reading. That's the first indicator. And to me, that's such a physical mismatch. It's not doing what Jim is talking about with curve cuts. And Jim, I just don't know if you wanted to mention the way that you do testing. I was struck by how the math problems are spaced out on the page. It just allowed for thinking. So that to me was a physical example as well.
Right. Yeah. I use A3 styled paper or sized paper for assessments. And what I'm trying to do is fit the entire assessment on one side. And it could be math, it could be science, it could be literacy in particular, where one-sided piece of paper, as big as you need it to be, can be the shape of that assessment. And what that is allowing the person to do is exactly the opposite of what a computer does. Computer testing puts up an element and then disappears, and puts up a new element and then disappears again. However, when you can space things out on a single-sided element, it's the exact opposite, because the test space becomes a map of the student's thinking. And the student's eyes can move back and forth and return over and over again, look for connections, and it becomes a greater map of their own thinking. So the more we reduce our items in an assessment to the thing that they can see more narrowly, the less we're going to get from them. And the more broad we can make it, the greater of a chance that we're giving for these important connections to be made. And so I found that my students are doing much better as they're able to see visually the map of their own thinking as they move through that process. And it's really exciting to be able to have that conversation with them about that map afterwards as well. And that gets to this idea of universal design. So if I created that assessment, or if we knew that we were doing something for someone, it's now being wrapped up into this kind of universal design movement. Not the idea of individualization, that everyone gets something slightly different, that we're going to hand only that one student that Mark was talking about different kinds of paper, and this other kid gets different kinds of pens, and this kid over here gets a stapler. But instead, we might pool those together and make more of a workstation during writing workshop sort of a thing. And we're able to identify what inhibitors that might have been there before and cut those away and bring together a singular design. It's also more efficient for teachers. The more we ask teachers to individualize their instruction, the less time they have for the whole group. So the greater of a design that we can make that's singular and one task that a teacher can accomplish that serves the most students, the more efficient we're going to be. And that's the idea behind universal design. We can't make multiple curb cuts for all types of uses. We need to make one that's great for everyone. And this is a universal curb cut that we can say. So we can go into a classroom and say, well, we need some curb cuts here because there's too many edges in this class. This kid gets this and this kid gets that. These kids aren't getting their needs serviced. We need a more universal design that is getting to everyone more quickly and more efficiently, and make that design more singular. And that's kind of what this is here. This strikes me as a bench, and it's from Japan, a city bench that almost anyone can use in any number of combinations: standing, leaning, sitting, laying, sleeping. It doesn't really matter. I think you could imagine all sorts of ways groups could use this bench in non-coronavirus times. And they can gather on it as a large group and use it very successfully. And not all benches are that way. We'll see an example of why that is in a minute. And also this, if you had two different carrot peelers here, you might immediately want to grab one. I hope you said the left in your mind. You would want to grab the left one. Well, my grandmother, a Mexican American in Phoenix, Arizona, had bad arthritis, and her hand is kind of shaped like mine. And when near the end of her life, she could only move it like this. And that carrot peeler just didn't do it. And so the cooking she wanted to do as a member of our family in big gatherings ended earlier than I think it should have in her life. The metal one is the one she had at that time, years and years ago, and she couldn't grip it anymore. But she could grip that one that is black and rubbery with kind of a haptic side to it that you can feel different sides. And I could use both, but even if both were in my drawer, I'm pretty sure the metal one I'd never touch, ever. I would always go for the black carrot peeler. And I think that's interesting because maybe, and in fact, it definitely was created, this carrot peeler, from this brand by a designer who recognized that someone in their family couldn't use the metal one either, and made one that was more universal. But now it's just better and it's the standard. You probably wouldn't buy the one on the right in any store. You would always use the one on the left. And that's a really interesting way to kind of think about the change in education that we're going through. When we find tools that are not as universally designed, that are hard for certain students to use, we'll gravitate away from it, and that will fall away and a better design will pop up. But intentionally looking for those and thinking about curb cuts and thinking about whether or not a tool, an instruction technique, are going to do those things, we're going to move towards that. My favorite one, Mark, that I think about when I think about literacy is kind of the advent of the classroom library.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a student can only go every week or every 2 weeks to the library, but now that we have classroom, it seems so obvious now. The classroom libraries are there for anyone learning a language, anyone in their home language of instruction. And that classroom library is there regularly, every day, free access whenever they want. If they need another book, they can go up and grab it. A good classroom library might even be separated by different genres or different levels, but it's there every day in the room that they spend the majority of their time in. And we take it for granted now, but there was a time when there was no such thing as a classroom library. And students' access to books was limited to the time that they could get in the school's library only. It's a great place to go, and it's an important place. And a librarian should never feel bad that there are classroom libraries, because this is that in-between phase. And we take it for granted now, but it is a universal access to literature in a school. And I just absolutely love it and love remembering that change in our education. This one is the large-handled thing. It looks like a bike handle, the foamy one. You've seen these in schools for sure. But sometimes it's hard to fit a student to the right one. And the box with many on the top of these grippers are specific to certain ways a student might hold it. And so some students might want one and not the other. It's not universal. They might not match themselves or be matched with the right gripper. But the one below that's really big and foamy is universal. Anyone can use it. It was actually designed for students on the autistic spectrum disorder, but the company that came up with this realized that there was an appeal outside of it and has been selling it everywhere now. And so schools are filling up with these foamy ones instead of these unique use grippers for pencils as students need it. And more students who never wanted something to grip a pencil with when they were young are starting to gravitate towards that one. That also gets me to an idea of a school universal design, a physical space. For my daughter, she had extreme anxiety, still does. She's 8 years old, but when she was about 3 years old, it was really hard for her, 3 and 4 years old, to play on a playground. This is an accessible, wheelchair accessible playground. And when we visited a school that she could run around and play on their playground one time, and kids started coming there. It was, I think, on a Saturday, so it's like open to the public, but it's a school playground in Arizona, I think, is where we were visiting family. As the kids were rushing onto the playground, we had gotten there a little bit early. I expected her to jump off and her anxiety to overtake the desire to play, and for her to run off and come crying to us, to my wife and I. It didn't happen that way. She stayed on. And I asked her why that was later, and she told me that the area was big enough or wide enough for her to feel safe on there. So not only was this playground wide enough or most universally designed for anyone to physically access the playground, it was also wide enough for my daughter's anxiety. So sometimes our designs that are universal, we couldn't even predict how great of a universal design it will become until much, much later. And we start recognizing other uses for what we've decided to create as we're going on. And when we're aware of that universal idea or curb cuts, our rabbit ears go up and we start looking for these things and we start talking about them with our colleagues and we start noticing them in our instruction and we start recognizing the true value of a lot of the programs that we're implementing and the tools that we use in our school. And this playground is certainly an example. And I definitely did write a letter to the school and said, hey, it appears as though your playground is anxiety compliant. Let me tell you a little bit about that. So it was a really great story in that sense. And this is from Microsoft, and we're going to kind of bounce to a couple other ideas in a moment. But if you want to, if you type in Microsoft permanent, temporary, and situational, you'll get this graphic. Not everything that we think of as a disability is permanent. Some of them are temporary and they're unreal, and some of them are situational. And check that out through my slideshow. Again, it's in my blog if you want, but it's really worth thinking about. What are we designing for? And it isn't the permanent need someone has. It might be temporary. It might be just a sleepy teenager when you had originally designed it for dyslexia, let's say. You'll find all these intersections that you never would have imagined before in your design. And just because you made a curb cut and you made things easier to access in your school and your learning doesn't mean that it actually works. I hope you're laughing wherever you are right now in the world. That is a ridiculous curb cut. So we do need to be thoughtful in our design and be reflective about that process. If we've designed something for access, was it genuinely much more accessible? That's awful. Yeah. Thank you for writing that in. It is terrible. I can't imagine what city this is or where it is, but I found it on the internet and I love it. So I'm going to use it in presentations for a while. It's sad. That brings me to something even more awful, by the way. Hostile design. I want you to start thinking about in your school, what is something that you have that's in place right now that's actually meant to inhibit students. That's the intention behind it is actual inhibiting. So this picture here, I think is designed to either get rid of street vendors or prevent people from crossing the street in their car, or most sadly, possibly rough sleeping from homelessness. That's definitely what this one is. These are river rocks embedded in concrete. This had most certainly been a safe space in a city where the homeless would sleep. But by putting in these big boulders, they have to move somewhere else. And I don't know if you can see it where you are, but it's snowy in this city and it's snow behind the little pedestrian bridge piece. So they've moved sleeping possibly out into the elements from homelessness. Now, why is this important? Well, this doesn't solve homelessness. Hostile design only pushes that behavior away. And we do this in school sometimes. We don't solve the problem that the kid is facing or the problem they're causing the school or peers. Sometimes we do things just to push it away further and not address the real causes. This is a swimming pool not too far from me in Vienna, Austria. My daughter likes to swim here. It's hostile towards the kids at play. It's a swirly pool thingy, and they don't want kids to play on top of the surface. So they put the same thing used to prevent homelessness and rough sleeping in a certain area for kids in the swimming pool. So the design of the pool incorporated something that was hostile towards towards kids. And yes, sometimes you see them getting caught in the swirl and trying to climb out and they can't do it right there and they're on the wrong side. And it's a tough place for them and they have to make it to somewhere else where they can safely get out of the pool as this swirly action and these jets are whooshing kids around. It's really sad to see that inside of a public swimming pool. This is my favorite one because we're going to use this analogy now. Mark and I are going to kind of jump into this, and that is spiking students. So hostile design is an interesting idea, but I want you to incorporate this idea of spiking students. That is a set of spikes that are definitely there for homelessness and prevent rough sleeping. I think I took this picture in Budapest, or I grabbed it from someone who is in Eastern Europe, and they are literal spikes. But sometimes what we're doing is we're spiking students in our schools in creating little micro moments that make their day more uncomfortable to prevent them from doing something in particular. And so I want to use that analogy of spiking. And I think, Mark, you're going to jump in kind of at this one, right?
Well, or actually, even we'll start with spiking. We'll move to this one. So the idea of spiking, an example I can give you of a typical spike that may happen, that I think we can start to look at our habits of teaching and kind of that idea of what are some small things I can do to make sure everyone has access to learning. So I was lucky enough to have as one of my mentors, Chris Tavani, who works with a lot of students. in high school who are very resistant readers. And she calls them resistant readers rather than struggling readers because she often works with students who have their driver's licenses. So she says to them, I think you probably are able to read in contexts that you enjoy. So the issue really is, how can I contextualize reading as you, to make something that you see as valuable? But I saw her teaching one day, and one of the things that she had as a standard of practice was to not spike students who didn't do their reading the night before. So this is a real quick example of something just to consider in your own thinking about teaching. So when students would come, and for whatever reason, if they didn't do the reading, if they didn't have their book, whatever it was, and this was 1984, the example I'm going to give you, she would start by saying, if you didn't have a chance to read last night, let me just catch you up where we are in the story, because she wanted to make very clear to her students. She used language like this: we're not reading this book for the story and for me to give you a quiz about what happened and who the characters are. We're reading this book to see if it resonates with our thinking today about our current society. That's why we're reading the book. So let me catch you up on the story and literally what happened, and then we're going to dig deep. And I've made copies of a paragraph here, a paragraph there, and you're going to meet in groups and really discuss and think about, this is what happened in the book, but does it have any connections to today? And she had a lot of readings that went along with the book and film clips. So I think that's an idea of not spiking, because a spike would be, oh, you didn't do the reading, you're not welcome here. You have to go to the dean, or you have to sit in the back, or you lose points. So what she was doing with that moment was saying to the students, everybody's welcome to do the deep thinking. Even if you didn't have a chance to read last night, we're going to dig deep together today.
Sure, a pop quiz on last night's chapter could be thought of as a spike.
Exactly.
It's only going to catch the kids that didn't do it.
Right.
And it's not going to get you to that analysis part that you were discussing, right?
Right, yeah. Exactly. So this is more of maybe a provocation. So this is a design of a underpass where they designed this to try to prevent drug addicts from being able to see their veins to inject intravenous drugs. So this design, the light here, you wouldn't be able to see your veins. So, but what happened was, you can see, obviously there was a lot of money spent on this, but the problem moved elsewhere. And I guess the provocation here I have, when I see this, I think, wow, a lot of money was spent here, but did it solve the problem? And I think one of the things we can think of structurally in schools is, are we spending money in the right ways? I can't tell you how many times in my career in my district, some new thing would come down, typically technology-based. This is going to be the answer to individualized science education. And one year my district spent over $500,000 on a program that was individualized science learning on different topics of student interest. And it literally lasted 1 year because it kept crashing the district server. So we had to get rid of it. So that idea of, there's a lot of money spent here, there's a lot of investment, but I think we even have to look on the concrete level sometimes in our structures and thinking, where are we spending money, and are we spending money in the right ways?
Excellent. Yeah, I worked at a school, as a quick connect, where there was a reading recovery specialist at my school in this district in Arizona. And I think we had 3 or 4 students that qualified for the service, and the neighboring school didn't have the funding for it and had more than 20 students that would have qualified for that service. And because of red tape, we couldn't move the person from one school to the other. So it had to be done underground in order to make that fit happen. And it's really sad, that it wasn't matching the needs at all. And in this case, when we spend a lot of time and money and effort trying to deal with the problems that students are creating, we're not thinking about the values that they bring us most directly, and how we can find our intersection with them as well. And it can be pretty frustrating as well. So thanks for that one. This is a lot of time and money and effort spent on these tickets. At the beginning, at the top of our hour, I was talking about these homework slips. Well, this is a picture of them. And my fingers are a little dirty. Sorry about that. Like, we use a lot of whiteboards where I am, so my hands are always dirty during the day. But that's just from one trimester, one quarter, I think, of a school year, from one class that one teacher was using these slips. That's a lot of time, and time is money, and teachers' time, evaluating students based on how they're walking into the room, and not providing them access to the learning, but just noting all the things that they had done wrong as they're walking in, not having homework, coming in late, or not having their materials. And it's time for the parents, as the parents have to respond to this, and it's time for the students. And we've invested a lot only to break the relationship apart. A student who's receiving a bunch of these are not probably interested in bonding with that teacher. And it could be something as easy as giving a student a pencil. Forget the slip, just have a big box of pencils, get them ready to go. We want great writers in the room, and we want them to have all the materials. We want to, like Mark's saying, we want them to have the right kind of paper. We want them to have the right kind of pencils, the right kind of time, the right kind of sound and space available to them. And we don't really want to push the onus on them to get everything exactly right and spend all that time pretending like they're not mistake makers. We want to provide them the space to make the right kind of mistakes and spend our money that way instead of on a bridge like this or a tunnel like this. All right, so I'm going to kind of go through this piece pretty quickly. Affordance and signifiers. If you can think about the tools in your school for literacy, science, it doesn't really matter. This frame is really powerful. And these next couple bits I'll just run right through. In design, an affordance and a signifier can work a little bit like this. An affordance is something in the design that allows someone to do something that you want with that tool. A handle on a tea kettle, a pull chain on this ceiling fan. And a signifier is the thing that tells the user how to use it. So a lot of times when I go into classrooms and I'm working with teachers or in my own classroom, I'm looking for what clues does a student have so they know how to navigate that environment successfully. That would be sort of the signifiers. What clues are they getting that they're on the right track? How do they know how to come in? How do they know how to leave? How do they know how to pick the right book? How do they know that their writing sample is that they're producing on an on-demand moment is going to fit the requirements? And the signifier, so the signifier are all those clues. And the affordances are the actual things in that space that they have. Are they afforded a quiet space to do their work? Do they have good partnerships built up with their teacher and classmates? Do they have enough pencils and paper and books and all the things that we want them to have are the actual thing we have. Affordances and signifiers are made famous by a guy named Don Norman. He wrote a book called The Design of Everyday Things, and it really lit up my world when it came to education because I really started seeing classrooms differently. And he was famous for Norman doors. So if you get a moment, just Google it and it'll entertain you. And a Norman door is usually a poorly designed door. If you look at this affordance here, you might want to grab this door and pull, but it says push. So the affordance, if I didn't read where it said push, I might pull and not get the reaction I want. The door is going to stay closed. So they had to add a signifier to tell you what to do, to actually push. So sometimes I go into classrooms where it feels very obvious of what the space is going to be used for, but then the teacher has to get up and say, now everyone, don't touch anything in this class. It is not for you. You know, and it's saying, I may have set up the environment and provided certain tools, but this isn't what you're actually going to do. Now you must listen to my careful 10 points demands that you need to do to navigate this next hour and through these exercises in this space. And that can be really hard for students to follow. And so we have a lot of kids with that sort of processing delay where they can't follow lots of signifiers and a lot of directions. And they only see the affordances and they make the mistakes. They pull instead of push. And so looking for that harmony between the affordances we provide and our messaging, our signifiers is a powerful one.
And just real quickly, the
Go for
affordance,
it. Yeah.
I'm sorry, a typical affordance I see in classrooms, and I use them too, are checklists or rubrics, but they're supposed to be for the user. So those of us who like to make tools, we might think the answer is a new rubric, the answer is a new checklist. But if we don't have the signifiers to make sure it's usable for the user, to make sure that that rubric or checklist is not confusing to the user, then all we're doing is spending time making affordances that the learner can't access to become an agent of their own learning. So anytime teachers say to me, I don't understand why they're not using the rubric to improve their writing, I don't use the term signifiers, like, well, what strategies have you given them to support them understanding how they might use that? So one thing to think about is, am I constantly in search of new affordances, where what I really need is to stick with the one I have and support the user so it makes sense.
Super. I'm going to skip these little bits. If you want to see a little bit more, I'd say go for it. But I really want to kind of turn the table back over to Mark a little bit. As we kind of think about universal design is a bonus, hostile design is terrible, and we're looking for ways to provide the right design to our students. I want to jump into this thing that we're calling micro moments. But if you want to check out these funny slides and kind of learn a little bit about them, knock yourself out. Again, it's on my blog. I hope that you do. In this idea of micro moments, I want to turn it over to Mark to introduce them, because it gets right down to the moment where you can be very effective tomorrow, or more reflective about what you're going to do and say with students. Mark, go for it.
So do you want to share the language ones, or should we just talk about a moment now? Yeah, should we do this one?
Up to
Yeah.
you. You want me to go to this one?
Yeah. So one
Okay.
way of thinking about micro moments is the idea of how our habits are. What are our micro habits around language, for example? So the idea of the way we use language can create spikes, or can create opportunities for students to learn. So if we go through these, the next slide will show you an example of maybe something like, if a student were to text you that says, "I didn't do my homework," one possible response is, "I'm going to email your parents." So if that's your sort of habit of response, think of that as one way of thinking about, possibly it could spike students, versus an alternative, which is, "I didn't do my homework. Okay, can you do it tonight? Do you need help? How about lunch?" It's this idea that I'm wondering why you didn't do your homework first, rather than immediately going to, there's some type of punishment behind it. Another way of thinking of micro moments in language has to do with, when you go to, we can go to the next slide. So I think a student might feel they're going to fail the test. Take it and let's see. Or an alternative to that is, "Truly, would you be willing to take it after getting help from me? When would you be available?" It's the idea, I want to sort of investigate why you think that, rather than going to some type of standard stock response. And then finally, if a student were to share with you something like this: "My team won the game." This could be in writing workshop. This could be physically in writing. This could be a text. So one possible response is, "This is how you spell team. Team is spelled T-E-A-M. Game is spelled G-A-M-E. Did you see it on the board?" As opposed to what I just call, "Let's just be human. It's so cool that you won the game. I'm glad you won." So the idea of what are our habits on interacting with students? So one thing to think about in your teaching in terms of a micro moment is, all of these become micro moments. So if a student writes, "My team won the game," and it's misspelled, you have choices. You can want to know about the game, or you can point out the spelling errors. And again, I love Jim's work with the idea of spikes versus accessibility. When we are more accessible, we want to know about the child, and less about immediately going to conventions in this case.
And I love this one. And I feel that this is maybe the most provocative one of all. We want students to spell well eventually. How we get there is incredibly important. And can we push it off at a later point where it's more reasonable? But a lot of our inclination is to correct students.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think of it as a spike, but in the classroom, I know I'm correcting students regularly. But if I design micro moments that are designed to connect with the student more directly, and then build in meaning as is necessary, that's a pathway I'm opening up with that student. That's a relationship that's getting deeper, and that is more meaning about the fact that they were able to communicate something important to them in the writing and give it to me, right? Is that kind of the idea that you're getting at a little bit too? Is yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And like even in math, and I've seen you work a little bit with math students, the idea that rather than saying that's wrong or telling them what's right, you often would say, "Well, tell me your thinking behind that. What was your thinking behind that?" That opens up the conversation. So again, we can look at these micro moments as, I would just partially consider them habits. What's our habit around our interactions with students around this idea of rightness and wrongness? What's our habit around a student saying something like, "I'm not ready for the test," or "I didn't do the homework"? So Chris's habit that I mentioned earlier is, if some of you didn't have a chance to read, I'm going to catch you up because this is our work today. Her habit shifted from, "Then I guess you failed the pop quiz," to, "You're welcome here. Everybody's welcome. This is an accessible room for you to do some deep thinking. I can't wait to get started." So that's the messaging.
Absolutely. I love mining the mistakes of students when I can scaffold micro moments in my mind and kind of be ready to think about how I'm going to respond to certain situations in a positive way. All the mistakes students are making, from not bringing their pencil all the way to a mathematical mistake or a mistake in grammar or anything. I'm ready for those. I have my micro moments sort of set, and I know how I'm going to respond in a way that is going to help move us forward, and that those mistakes are the things I'm looking for. I sometimes refer to school as a mistake factory a little bit. And I think we have like a manufacturing analogy next as well. Manufacturing those micro moments is super useful. And as I kind of prepare for students and what they're going to provide me back, I'm ready to use those moments in a really handy way that drives our narrative forward as student and teacher, and their learning forward, and their agency in their learning. So looking for those moments and working with peers, having PLCs that are designed around it, and looking to enable students through really micro designed interactions can be just as powerful as building a new classroom on that level to me. Did you have anything you want to include in the slide? I can't remember. I
Yeah,
apologize.
one of the things that we can do, I think, a simple, regardless of what you teach, if you manufacture your teaching so that after you teach something or when you're conferring with students, whatever you're doing, all the research would show, look for strengths first, look for something that's working. And one of the things that I often do in writing workshops specifically is I notice something that a student is doing, and then I can use that as a mentor text for the class. And these don't have to be big moments. One of the things, many years ago, I was teaching a poetry unit, and one of my students wrote with imagery. We'd been studying things like imagery and rhythm and different types of things in poetics. And so she wrote with imagery. So I just asked her name was Carrie, I said, can I share this example of imagery? And she said, sure. So this was a 30-second micro moment in her life. She was 11 years old, I believe, 11 or 12. So I shared the example of imagery, and I just said to the students, try something like what Carrie did. So then about 10 years later, her mother worked in my district. She texted her mother and said, can I have Mr. Overmeyer's email? She emailed me and said, I was working in composition today, and one of the cues they had to write to was, when did I first feel like a writer? And she said, I remembered when you said, I wrote a poem with imagery. So 10 years later, she remembered that micro moment. And I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, it's just something that I learned from one of my mentors, to build in that time, to look for strings, to look for things that can support other students, regardless of what you teach. So then the message is, all of you are welcome here, and we're all doing this work together. So I'm pointing out strengths that Jim has and the different students in the class, and that can support everyone.
Fantastic. And, to wrap it up, and we're kind of coming at the end, and thank you folks very much for being with us. And we've been happy to share with ECS and, the fantastic organization that it is. And we hope to meet you guys and work with you someday. This digital world is what it is, but definitely do contact us. We'd love to hear from you. Is to kind of think about these micro moments and kind of pack them into its own story. Think about the primary materials. I think I got that blocked a little bit. What's accessible and what isn't, and what makes something primary and what makes something secondary. Thinking about the universality of that design that you're looking to create. And finally, I love this as kind of a big takeaway. If you assume that students need you, then they will need your support. If we can flip that notion on its head a little bit, can the assumption of our design be about their agency and their independence more than it is about a dependent narrative that I drive in my classroom? And some things will never go away. I'm in there and I'm working with the students, but how much of it can I give to them to control successfully? And how do I scaffold for those great results, but also choices that they're going to make? I think I'll go to the next slide, and then you're going to kind of comment on that, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
Yeah.
I think we're wrapping it up here. Yeah.
Yeah, one word that you just used, Jim, I think is so important. So it's the idea of scaffolding versus true differentiation. I'm not anti-differentiation, but I think scaffolding is a more powerful term. So back to the beginning, that film, Crip Camp, they didn't want a differentiated movie theater. Their desire as a disability rights movement, as activists, they didn't say, give us movie theaters where we can go and you don't have to see us. They were like, we want access to everywhere. And a curb cut is such a physical example of that. That's not differentiation, that's a scaffold. Everyone can use that. Everyone can use that one bench that Jim showed. So the idea here is to scaffold, but when you design for your students universally, you can be ready to scaffold based on need, as opposed to saying, if your mindset is everybody needs something slightly different, I think what starts to happen, as Jim mentioned earlier, is what you can create is actually a lack of access. Where if you design with the idea that at some point I'm going to possibly provide a scaffold, that's very, very different. So this idea of designing it with that in mind, I think, is a really helpful mindset for all of us.
Perfect. And thank you for tying that back at the end there, from the movie all the way to kind of where we are and what we're doing. Yeah, so that was kind of a taster of some of the work that we're putting together. We're looking to get a lot deeper on this and also create offerings for other schools and online trainings and that sort of a thing through this. And this was kind of our debut moment. So it was kind of a proud moment for us. If you have any questions or any thoughts right now, I think we can take them for a couple of minutes. I definitely typed the wrong thing into this web chat. I was trying to type and listen at the same time. I apologize. If you have questions, kind of go for it. Otherwise, I can kind of turn it back over to Joe. But it's been a pleasure, Mark, to work with you as always. And Joe, it's always a pleasure to interact with ECS on any level. So thank you both very much.
Thanks everybody for joining, and thank you, Jim and Joe, for helping get this together.
Thank you so much, Jim and Mark. That was amazing. I know I've got a lot of key takeaways. My main one is that I'm going to be watching Crip Camp on Netflix this evening. But it was great to see so many kind of micro moment examples and the kind of hostile designs that are occurring in everyday life. And some of those examples were kind of mind blowing, especially with the pole right in the middle of the pavement. So thank you so much for all of your takeaways, and I know that many of our attendees will have found them very, very useful. If we have any questions for Jim and Mark, please pop them in the chat box. If not, I will be sharing this recording with everyone, and I will also get some, I know Jim and Mark mentioned some kind of key examples and some articles and some authors, so I will make sure I get those from them and pop them in a follow-up email, so you have all the information as well. Thank you so much once again, Jim and Mark. It was a pleasure having you both, and we would love to have you join us later on in the year, early part of next year, to talk more about your work and see where it's going. But thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you all.